The radio started speaking exactly 1 minute after my grandfather died. And the strangest part was that nobody had plugged it in for almost 15 years. It happened during a thunderstorm in late October in the small mountain town where I grew up, the kind of place where fog stayed low across the roads even after sunrise, and every house looked abandoned after dark. I had returned there only because my mother asked me to clean out my grandfather's cabin before winter arrived. He had lived alone for years near the edge of Black Hollow Forest, 3 miles away from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dead pine trees that creaked constantly in the wind like old wooden ships. I arrived just before sunset, carrying 2 bags and a flashlight, expecting nothing more than dust, silence, and old memories. The cabin looked exactly the same as it had when I was a child, except smaller somehow and far more lifeless. The porch sagged lower than before, the windows were cloudy from age, and the old weather vane above the roof spun slowly even though there was almost no wind. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the smell: damp wood, cigarette smoke, and something metallic underneath it all. Not strong enough to identify, but enough to make me uncomfortable. The power was barely functioning. Only 2 lights worked in the entire cabin, and they flickered every few seconds as rain hammered against the roof. I spent the first hour cleaning shelves and boxing old photographs while trying to ignore the strange silence outside. There were no insects, no birds, no distant traffic, just rain and the occasional groan of the trees shifting in the storm. Around 9:13 that night, I found the radio in the attic. It was an old military-style receiver with cracked dials and faded numbers across the front. I recognized it immediately because my grandfather had been obsessed with it when I was younger. He used to sit beside it every night, adjusting frequencies for hours while scribbling things into small notebooks. Whenever I asked what he was listening to, he always gave the same answer: voices that got lost on the way home. At the time, I thought he was joking. Standing there in the attic, staring at the dusty machine under a white cloth, I remembered something else too. After my grandmother died, he claimed the radio spoke to him at night. My mother believed it was grief making him unstable, and eventually everyone stopped discussing it entirely. I almost laughed thinking about it, but the attic suddenly felt colder than the rest of the cabin. Not normal cold, the kind that settles directly onto your skin. I picked up the radio anyway and carried it downstairs, mostly out of curiosity. The power cord had been cut near the base. It physically could not turn on. I placed it on the kitchen table while sorting through other junk, and for nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then, exactly at 10:17, the speaker crackled once. I froze immediately. It was a sharp burst of static, loud enough to echo through the cabin. I stared at the radio, waiting for another sound, convincing myself there had to be a logical explanation. Old electronics do strange things sometimes: static electricity, residual charge. I tried to ignore it and kept cleaning, but 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, the static lasted longer, followed by a low sound buried underneath it. At first, I thought it was interference from the storm, but then I realized it sounded almost human. Not clear words, just breathing. I ended the call without thinking, my thumb moving on instinct, and for a moment I just sat there in the dark, listening to my own breathing, trying to convince myself it was some kind of glitch, some crossed signal, anything that made sense. But then my phone rang again. Same number, no delay, as if it had never stopped. I didn't want to answer it this time, but I couldn't ignore it either. Not when it felt so deliberate, so focused, like it knew I was there, waiting. I picked up again, slower this time, my hand slightly shaking, and before I could even speak, the sound returned, clearer now, more structured, and this time I understood something that made my stomach drop. It was trying to mimic me. Not just my words, but my tone, my rhythm, repeating fragments of what I had said earlier, but slightly off, like a recording that had been damaged. I whispered to myself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be, but the sound responded again, closer this time, more accurate, as if it was improving with each attempt. I hung up again, this time turning the phone off completely, pressing the button until the screen went black, but the silence that followed didn't feel like relief. It felt heavier. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness of the room, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think logically, but something kept pulling my attention toward the window, toward the faint outline of the trees outside, swaying slightly in the night wind. That's when I heard it, not from the phone this time, but from somewhere outside, faint and uneven, an imitation of breathing, carried through the trees like it had found another way to reach me. I froze completely, every muscle locking in place as I listened, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the sound didn't behave like anything natural. It didn't move consistently. It didn't fade the way distance should make it fade. It just existed, somewhere out there, and somehow getting closer without ever crossing the space in between. I told myself it was just my imagination, that my mind was connecting things that weren't connected. But then it changed again, shifting from that broken breathing into something worse, something that almost formed my name but never quite completed it, like it was testing the shape of it. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air smelled stronger there, metallic, rotten. I reached the bedroom doorway and slowly pushed the door open. The room was empty except for the bed, an old dresser, and dozens of notebooks stacked across the floor. But the window was open wide. Rain blew through the curtains, while muddy footprints ended directly beneath the window frame. On the wall above the bed, someone had carved words into the wood, not scratched, carved deep enough to splinter the surface. It said, "They only speak through the dead." Before I could process it, the radio screamed. Not static, an actual scream, loud enough to shake the entire cabin. I heard footsteps charging down the hallway behind me, fast, unnatural. I spun around, but saw nothing except darkness rushing toward the doorway. I slammed the bedroom door shut and held it with both hands while something struck the other side, hard enough to rattle the hinges. Another impact came immediately after, then another. The wood began cracking near the handle. The radio voice returned beneath the screaming static. My grandfather again, desperate now, begging me not to listen to it. I don't know how long I stayed there holding the door, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 5 minutes, but eventually the pounding stopped completely. Silence returned so suddenly it felt unnatural. I waited before opening the door again. The hallway outside was empty. The footprints were gone. The cabin stood completely still. Then I noticed one final thing. The radio sat at the far end of the hallway, facing directly toward me, even though I had left it in the kitchen. Slowly, the speaker crackled one last time. A quiet voice whispered something I still think about almost every night. It said, "There are more of us now." The next morning, I left before sunrise and never returned to Black Hollow again. A few weeks later, while unpacking my bags at home, I discovered one of my grandfather's notebooks hidden beneath my clothes. I know for a fact I never packed it. Most of the pages contained radio frequencies, dates, and weather notes, but near the end, I found a final entry written shakily across several pages. He described hearing voices through abandoned frequencies late at night, voices belonging to people who had recently died nearby. At first, they only spoke briefly, asking for help or repeating names. But eventually, something else began answering instead, something pretending to be them. The final sentence in the notebook was written larger than the rest, almost like a warning left in panic. If the radio learns your voice, it never stops listening. I wanted to throw the notebook away immediately, but before I could, my phone rang beside me. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. For several seconds, there was only static. Then I heard my grandfather breathing softly on the other end of the line. People disappear in forests all the time, but nobody talks about the ones who come back different. I learned that the hard way 3 years ago during a hiking trip deep in northern Washington in a stretch of wilderness so isolated that even local rangers avoided patrolling it after sunset. At first, I thought the stories were exaggerated. Every small town has legends designed to scare tourists away from dangerous places. Missing hikers, strange noises, animals acting unnatural. I never believed any of it until I spent one night inside that forest and realized the trees themselves were not the worst thing hiding there. It started in late September when my friend Daniel invited me on a weekend hiking trip near a place called Griever's Ridge. He found the location online while searching for abandoned fire watchtowers, and the pictures looked incredible. Endless pine forests, steep cliffs, and old logging trails stretching for miles without another human being in sight. Daniel loved exploring places most people avoided. I was less adventurous, but I agreed because I needed a break from work and city life. We left Seattle early on a Friday morning and reached the small town nearest the trail just before evening. The town itself felt strange immediately. Half the buildings looked abandoned, and almost nobody walked outside despite the weather being clear and cold. The gas station clerk stared at us for several seconds when we mentioned Griever's Ridge. He asked how long we planned to stay there. Daniel laughed and said only 2 nights. The man looked uncomfortable after hearing that. He leaned closer and quietly told us not to enter the forest after dark, especially if we heard movement outside our tents. He claimed people sometimes wandered off the trails at night and were never found again. Daniel thought the warning was entertaining. I didn't. Something about the way the man said it felt genuine, almost rehearsed, like he had repeated those same words many times before. We reached the trailhead around 5:30 in the evening. Fog drifted low between the trees, and the temperature dropped sharply the moment we stepped out of the truck. The forest looked ancient. Massive pine trees blocked most of the sunlight even before sunset, creating long shadows across the narrow trail ahead. Everything smelled damp and earthy, like wet bark and old leaves. At first, the hike felt normal, peaceful even. We joked around while carrying our gear deeper into the woods, stopping occasionally to check maps and take photos. But after about an hour, I noticed something unsettling. The forest was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no distant animal sounds, just the crunch of our boots against dirt and the occasional groan of branches shifting overhead. I mentioned it to Daniel, but he brushed it off and kept walking. Around sunset, we reached an old clearing beside a dried riverbed and decided to set up camp there for the night. The place felt wrong immediately. The trees surrounding the clearing leaned inward unnaturally, almost as if they were bending toward the center. Several trunks had deep marks carved into the bark, dozens of thin vertical scratches running several feet high. They looked too organized to be caused by animals. Daniel thought they were old trail markings left by loggers, but I wasn't convinced. While gathering firewood, I found something else near the edge of the clearing, a backpack hanging from a branch about 8 feet above the ground. It looked old and weather-damaged, covered in dirt and mold. Inside were water bottles, a flashlight, and a folded map dated nearly 7 years earlier. No wallet, no phone, no explanation. Daniel immediately became excited, convinced we had stumbled onto some forgotten mystery. But the discovery made me deeply uncomfortable. Someone had left that backpack there and never returned for it. As darkness settled across the forest, the atmosphere changed completely. Fog thickened between the trees until visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. The campfire barely illuminated the clearing, and beyond the light, everything looked pitch black. We ate quietly while the wind moved softly through the branches overhead. Around 9 o'clock, I heard footsteps somewhere beyond the trees. Slow footsteps, deliberate. They circled the clearing once before stopping. Daniel heard them too. He grabbed a flashlight and swept it across the forest, but there was nothing there. No movement, no reflection from animal eyes, just endless rows of trees disappearing into fog. We convinced ourselves it was probably a deer and eventually crawled into our tents. I barely slept. Every few hours I woke to strange noises outside, soft crunching sounds, branches snapping in the distance. Once I heard what sounded almost like whispering carried by the wind, too faint to understand clearly. Around 2:13 in the morning, I noticed something worse. The forest had become silent again, completely silent. Then I heard Daniel calling me from outside my tent. His voice sounded strange, flat, emotionless. He kept repeating my name softly from somewhere near the trees. I reached for my flashlight, but froze when I realized something impossible. Daniel was still inside his tent beside mine. I could hear him snoring quietly through the fabric wall. The voice outside continued calling me, closer now, moving slowly around the clearing. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. After several minutes, the voice stopped abruptly. A few seconds later, something brushed lightly against the side of my tent. I nearly screamed. Whatever touched it moved slowly along the fabric, creating a soft scraping sound before disappearing into the darkness again. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I told Daniel everything. He looked unsettled for the first time since arriving there, but he still insisted we continue hiking toward the fire watch tower, another few miles north. I wanted to leave immediately, but I also didn't want to seem paranoid, so we packed our gear and continued deeper into the forest. That decision almost got us killed. The deeper we went, the stranger the woods became. Trees grew denser, twisting together so tightly that sunlight barely reached the ground. Several times we noticed piles of animal bones scattered beside the trail, picked completely clean without any sign of predators nearby. Around noon, we discovered another abandoned campsite hidden among the trees. A torn tent lay collapsed beside a cold fire pit, partially covered in moss, as if it had been there for years. What disturbed me most were the shoes. Two muddy hiking boots sat neatly beside the tent entrance, perfectly aligned, like someone had calmly stepped out of them and vanished barefoot into the woods. Daniel finally admitted the place was getting unsettling. We decided to turn back immediately. But when we checked the map, the trail behind us no longer made sense. Landmarks we passed earlier were gone. The dried riverbed had disappeared. Even the terrain looked unfamiliar somehow. We spent the next 2 hours trying to retrace our route, but every direction led deeper into dense forest. It felt impossible, like the woods were rearranging themselves around us. Then the footsteps started again, slow, heavy, always behind us. Every time we stopped walking, they stopped too. Daniel shouted several times, demanding whoever was following us come out, but nobody answered. The only response was movement between the trees, dark shapes shifting just beyond sight. At around 4:40 that afternoon, we found a tree covered in photographs nailed directly into the bark. Hundreds of them, old missing person photos, faded by rain and sunlight. Men, women, children, some dated back decades, others looked recent. I recognized one face immediately from a poster at the gas station near town. A teenage girl who disappeared hiking 6 months earlier. Daniel became visibly shaken after seeing that tree. We both realized then that someone had been placing those photos there intentionally. Before we could leave, we heard movement directly behind us. Fast movement, something large crashing through the forest at impossible speed. We ran immediately. Branches tore at our clothes while we sprinted downhill through dense fog, slipping over roots and rocks. The footsteps chased us the entire time, not one set, multiple, surrounding us from every direction. I remember hearing breathing close beside me, despite seeing nobody there.
At one point, I glanced behind and caught sight of a figure standing between the trees, maybe 30 feet away. Tall, thin, motionless. Its skin looked unnaturally pale against the darkness. Then another figure appeared farther back, then another. None of them moved normally. They simply appeared closer each time I looked. Daniel fell while crossing a narrow ravine, twisting his ankle badly. I stopped to help him, and that was when we heard voices calling from the forest around us. Human voices, some crying, some whispering. One sounded exactly like my mother. Another sounded like Daniel himself, even though he was beside me. The voices kept urging us deeper into the woods, promising safety, promising help. Daniel panicked completely at that point. He started limping toward the trees, despite me grabbing his arm and yelling at him to stop. He kept insisting someone was out there calling for him. Then he suddenly froze mid-step. His expression changed instantly, like confusion turning into terror. He whispered that the people between the trees weren't walking towards us. They were growing out of the ground. I looked where he was staring and saw pale shapes emerging slowly beside the roots, human forms blending unnaturally with bark and soil, faces pressed halfway through tree trunks, mouths hanging open silently. We ran again without stopping. Eventually, we reached an old logging road just before dark and somehow found our truck less than a mile farther downhill. Neither of us spoke during the drive back to town. Daniel kept staring silently out the window the entire time, breathing too fast. When we finally reached the gas station again, the same clerk looked at us with an expression that made my stomach drop immediately. He asked where the third person was. I told him there were only two of us. The man frowned and said we had arrived with someone else on Friday morning, a tall man wearing a gray jacket who never spoke. Daniel and I just stared at him because nobody else had been with us. The clerk insisted he remembered clearly. He even pointed toward security cameras mounted outside the building. A police officer later reviewed the footage for us. I wish he hadn't. The video showed our truck pulling into the station exactly like I remembered. Daniel stepped out first, then I stepped out from the passenger side. But a few seconds later, another figure climbed slowly out of the truck bed behind us, tall, thin, wearing a gray jacket soaked with mud. Neither Daniel nor I reacted to it in the footage. It simply followed several feet behind us while we walked into the store, moving with slow, unnatural steps. The security camera never showed it leaving. Daniel disappeared 3 months later. Police believed he left voluntarily after suffering psychological trauma from the trip, but I know that isn't true. A week before he vanished, he called me late at night, sounding terrified. He claimed he kept hearing footsteps outside his apartment every evening after sunset. He also said plants inside his home were dying unusually fast, turning black within days. The last thing he told me still keeps me awake sometimes. He said the forest never lets people leave completely. Part of it follows you home. Last winter, I found muddy footprints outside my apartment window after heavy snowfall. They began at the street below and ended directly beneath the glass. There were no footprints leading away.
The first time the boy predicted someone's death, everyone thought it was a horrible coincidence. By the fourth time, people in town stopped making eye contact with him completely. I was 16 when I met him, during the coldest winter our town had seen in nearly 20 years, in a place so small and isolated that everyone knew each other's routines better than their own. The town sat between long stretches of frozen farmland and dark woods that looked almost black after sunset. Nothing unusual ever happened there. That was why people noticed the boy immediately. He arrived in January with his mother, renting the old white house at the edge of Maple Street, the one abandoned for years after the previous owner died alone inside it. His name was Elias. Thin, pale, quiet, maybe 12 years old at most. He barely spoke at school and spent most of his time staring out windows like he was listening to something far away. At first, people just assumed he was shy or disturbed from moving around too much. Then the predictions started. The first happened during math class. A teacher named Mr. Grayson accidentally dropped a stack of papers, and while everyone laughed, Elias simply looked down at his desk again and said he saw water and broken glass. 2 days later, Mr. Grayson died after his car slid off an icy bridge during heavy rain. The windshield shattered when the car hit the river below. After that, nobody wanted to sit near Elias anymore. Teachers avoided calling on him. Students whispered about him constantly in hallways. But what disturbed me most was that Elias never looked proud or excited when his predictions came true. He always looked exhausted, like each one frightened him more than anyone else. I first spoke to him a week later during lunch. He was sitting alone near the back of the cafeteria while snow fell heavily outside the windows. I remember feeling strangely nervous walking toward him, even though he was just a kid. When I sat down, he looked at me immediately with an expression I still cannot fully describe. Not surprise, recognition, like he already knew I would sit there. I asked him if the rumors were true. He stayed quiet for several seconds before softly saying he never wanted to see those things. I asked what he meant, and he told me the visions came before people died, sometimes hours before, sometimes days. He said they always started the same way. First came the sound of footsteps behind him when nobody was there. Then he would dream about someone standing in darkness without a face. After that, he would suddenly know exactly how somebody nearby was going to die. I wanted to believe he was lying or mentally unstable, but something about the fear in his voice felt genuine. He wasn't trying to scare anyone. If anything, he looked desperate for someone to believe him. Over the next few weeks, more deaths happened. A local mechanic suffered a heart attack alone in his garage after Elias mentioned hearing heavy breathing near him during class. An elderly woman died in her sleep 2 days after Elias quietly told a teacher that she kept appearing in her dreams surrounded by flowers and candles. Each prediction became more specific, more impossible to dismiss. People in town started crossing streets to avoid him. Parents complained to the school, demanding he be removed. Some claimed he was cursed. Others believed he somehow caused the deaths himself. I didn't know what to believe anymore, but I kept talking to him because part of me felt sorry for him. He looked more exhausted every day. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and sometimes during conversations, he would suddenly stop speaking and stare into empty corners of rooms like he heard something moving there. One evening in February, I visited his house after school because he had failed to show up all week. The old White House looked even worse up close. Most windows were covered with blankets from the inside, and the porch creaked violently beneath my feet. Snow had piled high around the yard, untouched except for a single trail of footprints leading to the backyard woods. When Elias opened the door, he looked terrified, not sick, terrified. His mother stood silently behind him in the hallway, pale and exhausted, as if neither of them had slept in days. Inside the house, every clock had been removed from the walls. I noticed that immediately. Elias saw me looking and quietly explained that the ticking made the footsteps louder. I asked what he meant, but before he could answer, something thudded upstairs, heavy, slow, like someone walking across the second floor. Elias froze instantly. His mother shut the television door without saying a word and turned the television volume higher, even though nothing was playing except static. I remember feeling an overwhelming urge to leave right then, but curiosity kept me there. Elias eventually admitted the visions had changed recently. He said he no longer only saw strangers dying, now he saw people before they disappeared. I asked what that meant, and he whispered something that still stays with me. He said death was not the worst thing following those people anymore.
That night, while snow hammered against the windows outside, Elias showed me a notebook hidden beneath the couch. Inside were dozens of names, dates, and sketches. Some drawings showed faceless figures standing beside beds. Others showed dark hallways with tall shadows near doorways. One page disturbed me more than the rest. It contained a rough sketch of our school hallway, with several students standing together. Every face was crossed out, except mine. Before I could ask about it, another loud thud came from upstairs, closer this time. Then came footsteps, slow footsteps moving across the ceiling directly above us. Elias looked like he was about to cry. His mother immediately turned the television volume even louder, but the footsteps continued anyway. I asked who was upstairs. Neither of them answered. Then the footsteps stopped directly above the living room. Silence filled the house completely. A few seconds later, something scratched slowly across the ceiling, long, deliberate, like fingernails dragging through wood. I left immediately after that. Elias grabbed my arm before I reached the door and begged me not to stay outside after dark for the next few days. I asked why, but he only stared at me with that same terrified expression and whispered that it finally noticed me too. I barely slept that night. Every small noise outside my bedroom window made my heart race. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly because I heard footsteps in the snow outside my house. Slow, heavy. I looked through the curtains, expecting to see someone walking along the road, but there was nobody there. Only fresh footprints leading across our yard toward the woods behind the house. The next day at school, Elias did not show up again. Neither did his mother. Rumors spread quickly that they had left town overnight, but something about it felt wrong. That evening, I decided to visit the house one more time.
Snow continued falling heavily as I walked down Maple Street, and the entire neighborhood looked strangely empty. No lights, no people outside. When I reached the white house, the front door stood slightly open. Inside, every room was empty, furniture gone, clothes gone, even the curtains had been removed. The house felt abandoned again, except for one thing. Footprints covered the floorboards, muddy footprints, dozens of them leading upstairs. I should have left immediately, but instead I followed them. The second floor smelled damp and rotten, like wet wood left underground too long. At the end of the hallway, one bedroom door stood partially open. I pushed it slowly and found the walls covered completely in writing. Dates, names, predictions, hundreds of them scratched directly into the wallpaper. Most names had lines drawn through them. Near the center of the room, written larger than everything else, was today's date followed by my name. My stomach dropped instantly. Then I noticed the closet door slowly moving, not opening, breathing. The wood shifted inward and outward slightly, like something inside was pressing gently against it. I backed away immediately, but before I reached the hallway, I heard Elias speaking softly from inside the closet. He sounded exhausted, weak. He kept repeating that he was sorry. I remember standing frozen in the doorway, unable to move while the closet door creaked open inch by inch. The darkness inside looked far deeper than it should have been, almost unnatural. Then I saw movement. A tall figure unfolding slowly from the darkness behind the hanging clothes. Thin arms, long fingers, no face. Elias suddenly screamed for me to run. I did. I ran downstairs so fast I nearly broke my ankle slipping on the steps. The moment I reached the front door, I heard footsteps charging across the second floor above me. Not human footsteps, too heavy, too fast. I threw myself outside into the snow and never looked back. Police searched the house the following morning after I told them everything. They found nothing upstairs. No writing, no footprints, no Elias, no mother. But one officer later admitted they discovered something strange in the bedroom closet.
The back wall contained deep scratch marks carved into the wood from the inside, as if someone had spent years trying to claw their way out. Nearly 10 years have passed since then. Most people in town barely remember Elias anymore. They treat the deaths like unfortunate coincidences connected by paranoia and gossip. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps outside my apartment after midnight. Slow footsteps that stop directly beneath my bedroom window. Last month, I woke up to find muddy footprints across my kitchen floor leading toward the hallway mirror. They ended there, no footprints leading away. Yesterday morning, while checking old boxes and storage, I found Elias's notebook hidden beneath my clothes. I know I never took it from that house. Most pages were empty now, except for one new sentence written shakily across the final page. It said, "The predictions were never warnings, they were invitations."